Welcome back to an introduction to writing philosophy. This lesson will focus on research. So by the end of this lecture, you should know where to look for quality sources for a philosophy paper, understand the role that research plays in a philosopher's work, and be able to create a mini bibliography, basically a preliminary list of sources that you think will be useful in writing your paper. So let's talk a little bit about the role that research plays in philosophy, because this may or may not be so clear. It's pretty clear where research plays a role in things like science or maybe history, but what about philosophy? Well, it's actually a really important part of the writing process as a whole. Writing philosophy does not just include the time that we spend typing away or jotting down notes on pieces of paper. It also involves a lot of thinking. It involves a lot of reading other philosophers' works or reading other writings that are related to philosophy. Besides being grounded in logical argumentation, part of what makes philosophy a rigorous discipline is the research that writers conduct while they're preparing their work. Having a paper that is well researched will demonstrate a few important things about you as a writer. First, it will demonstrate that you are aware of other work that's been done in philosophy in relation to your topic. It will demonstrate that you understand what others have tried to do before you, and that your own work is a contribution to a broader discussion around whatever this topic happens to be. It will also demonstrate that you are willing and able to critically engage with the work of other writers, that you are able to explain what other philosophers have argued for, as well as being capable of highlighting both the strengths and the weaknesses of their arguments. And finally, your research will show that you've developed your own position not because you aren't aware of other opposing views, but precisely because you have considered the arguments of others and you still take the position that you do. Which is to say, it shows that the reason you hold your particular view is because you haven't yet heard a stronger argument for thinking otherwise. And that's a really important message for a reader to take away from your work. All of these things help to establish you as a credible authority on your topic, which, besides building trust between you and your reader, ultimately makes your argument worth considering in the first place. Research also helps your reader. We should talk about that too. It helps them to form a meaningful opinion of their own on the topic that you present on the position that you've taken with respect to that topic, and the arguments that you've crafted in defense of your position. So research, and including research in your work, will help to point your reader in the direction of other sources that focus on your topic that they can then read more about if they like. It also presents a balanced picture by providing arguments that both support and oppose your view. And finally, if your reader is also a philosophy writer, perhaps even someone who desires to build upon or maybe critique the argument that you've laid out, then ensuring your work is well researched will help them to do that. Lastly, research, and in particular citing our sources, is absolutely crucial to maintaining the integrity that philosophical work calls for. It should be clear, should not be ambiguous whatsoever, which portions of your paper are your own original ideas and which you have borrowed, built upon, or criticized from other writers. Research shows your reader where you're getting your information from so that they can verify for themselves that you've understood the sources you're pulling from and that you are accurately representing the contents of these other sources in your work. And finally, it gives credit where credit is due. If you've taken any kind of writing class, then you already know that representing someone else's ideas as your own is plagiarism, and philosophy is no exception. So in sum, research plays a number of very important roles in the field of philosophy, and in fact at every stage of the writing process, from the time we start to craft our arguments to the time after we share our work with others. Now let's talk about some places we can look for sources for a philosophy paper. And for the purposes of this lecture, I'll be focusing mainly on the kinds of sources that will be helpful for completing your bibliography assignment for this module. Your bibliography assignment, in turn, is basically organized around the structure of your paper. So you're looking for sources that will help you with your context section, your argument and exposition, and your objections and responses. Let's begin by looking at encyclopedias. These are sources that will be especially helpful in shaping the context and background section of your paper. And they will also likely serve as thorough introductions to the topic you've chosen to write about, and in particular, whatever relevance to philosophy it has. There are at least two major encyclopedias that are devoted exclusively to philosophy. These are the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, or SEP, and the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, or IEP. Both of these are excellent sources for information about particular schools of thought, specific philosophers, or particular topics of debate within philosophy. The articles on both of these sites are usually written by philosophers who also happen to be experts on the topic they're writing about. In many cases, they've even authored papers of their own on the topic that the article focuses on. So you may even see the author of the article's name in the article's bibliography section. Not always, but that does happen pretty often. Usually these articles start by covering the history of a particular debate, and they focus on the major arguments that have been raised. And both sites go into a lot of detail. In my experience, SEP articles are usually more detailed and longer than IEP articles. And there are also cases where you'll find that there may be topics that maybe the IEP has an article on, but the SEP doesn't, and vice versa. An important thing to keep in mind is that these articles are not really written for a general audience. They're written by scholars for other scholars. And so they do tend to assume a fairly high degree of familiarity with philosophy. But here's the thing, is if you're writing a philosophy paper, then you are a scholar. So these articles are written for you. I'm just pointing out that the terminology you may encounter, particularly in like these kinds of sources, is very technical, and it does assume, like I said, a lot of familiarity. But the good thing is that the more kinds of these articles that you read, the more familiar you will become with the terms that they're using. Of course, if you have trouble, if you find like a source that you think would be really helpful, but you're not totally sure you're understanding what the author is saying, then you can always share it with me and we can go over it together and explain, what they're talking about. Because that's the thing, is that reading philosophy in and of itself is kind of a skill of its own. So this is another reason that I guess I didn't talk too much about earlier, but is probably worth pointing out, is that the research stage of your writing process is it's just such an important opportunity to learn this valuable skill of learning how to read philosophy. The other kind of source we should talk about would be curator sites. These are sites like PhilPapers or JSTOR. These basically collect a bunch of different sources and store them in a digital library for researchers like yourself to read, and in some cases download online versions of. PhilPapers is especially helpful because it is organized by topic, and there is usually an abstract or an overview of the topic and the relevant arguments and debates and positions. These tend to be very detailed, and the number of topics that PhilPapers has indexed is pretty expansive. So if there's a topic you're planning to write about, chances are there's probably an indexed page on PhilPapers that will link you to all kinds of articles that focus specifically on that issue. Lastly, another good place is a physical library, if that's an option for you. If you live near a library and you have a library card, some libraries may also have like electronic versions of books that you can borrow digitally. So even if you don't live near a physical one, if you have a library card, you might be able to download like an ebook version of something. It's always good to check to see if your library has a book before you buy it, because books are getting like really, really expensive. There's also the Internet Archive too. I'll be honest, I use the Internet Archive a lot in my research. What I'll do a lot of times is before I buy a book, if it's available, what I'll do is I'll Google the name of the book and just add in the letters PDF. And almost always the Internet Archive is the first one that comes up if there is, in fact, a PDF version of the book available. Now, again, these are just a few examples of resources. The purpose of this lecture is not to serve as like a comprehensive overview of every source you can look for philosophical papers or materials related to writing a philosophy paper. I guess the main focus, the main thing I'm trying to impress upon you is how important research is, how important it is to our reader, and how important it is to us as writers. With that in mind, the last thing I want to talk about is some healthy research habits. So this is to help you as a researcher. First thing I would suggest is make sure to note each source as you read. Really try to keep track of where you're getting your information from. Where did I take this from? Is this something that I came up with myself, or is this something that I read somewhere? And these are not good places we want to end up in our writing. For one thing, it puts us at a much higher risk of potentially plagiarizing someone else's work, and it also ends up making a whole lot more work for ourselves. So just taking that little extra time to maybe keep a notepad next to you while you're scanning through articles, jotting down the name of the article and the author, and just trying to keep a log of where you're getting your information from. When you find a paper, I would suggest first thing look for the abstract, if there is one. An abstract is basically, usually it's like 100, maybe 150 words, a summary of what the paper consists of. If there's not an abstract, then the first thing I usually do personally is I read the introduction and I read the conclusion. I mean, this is just if I'm looking at a bunch of papers and I'm trying to figure out which one is going to be relevant. When it comes to actually selecting a source and planning to use it in your research, you got to read the whole thing. You can't just read a couple paragraphs. But if you're just in that stage where you're pouring through, like you got like 10 or 20 articles that all seem to be somewhat related to your topic, you're trying to figure out which one would be best or which ones would be best to cite, you can start by looking at the intro and the conclusion, because usually most authors will use these spaces to include some kind of brief summary of their arguments as well as the contents of their paper in general. And last healthy research habit that I would suggest would be make sure to take note of any frequently cited materials. So you'll see this a lot. If you start reading a lot of papers on a topic, you're bound to start seeing certain authors or certain titles of papers come up in the in-text citations, or if you look at the bibliographies that the authors include at the end of their papers. You might see with certain topics that certain authors' names come up a lot, or particular papers from a certain year come up. This is usually a good sign that whatever topic you're writing about, this author and or this paper that they've written was a major work within this field of philosophy or within this particular debate in philosophy. And if that's the case, this is probably a source that you would want to be familiar with. So noting each source as we read, looking for an abstract or a summary of the argument, and taking note of any names or papers that come up quite frequently in citations. These are all ways to help kind of make our research more efficient. It can help us avoid falling into the trap of going down a research rabbit hole where we're either just focusing on one particular thing that's maybe only tangentially related to our topic, or going the other extreme of just sort of becoming snowblind in our research where we actually don't know what we're looking for. These tips are designed to help you stay focused.